Now, as I've mentioned before, the other way to create NURBS surfaces is to use curves. Now, before we start creating surfaces, we need to first learn how to create curves. So we can do this in a couple of ways. First, we have a couple of curves here on our shelf, but let's take a look at the Create menu so we can get a little more specific. Now, in the Create menu, we do have two types of curves under the NURBS primitives. And probably the most important one is the circle. So if I select circle and left click and drag, you can see I can create a circle. And if I right click over this, you can go into control vertex mode. And as you can see, we have all of our control vertices or CVs. And we can select these CVs and move them and manipulate the shape and size of this curve. If we go back in object mode, you can see that we've now reshaped this. Now, if we want to get a little bit more specific, we can draw our curves from scratch. And we can do this by going into the Create menu and going under Curve Tools. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tear this off so we can see it. And I'm also going to draw this in an orthographic viewport, and that just makes it a little bit more accurate. So I'm going to hop out to my 4-view and then highlight my top window. And let's go ahead and draw these from the top. So the first one is the CV curve tool, and this is kind of like the mother of all curves. Almost every curve that you create eventually becomes a CV curve tool. There's one exception, which we'll see in just a bit. Now the CV curve requires 4 points to define a curve. So let's go ahead and select this. And as you can see, we get a different icon. And let's go ahead and lay down that first point. So when I do that, that first point is basically a box, and that tells you it's the first point of the curve. The second point is a U shape. Now this is important because it determines the direction of the curve, and this will be important as you start using curves for other things. Direction can be very important. Now after these first two, everything else comes up as a point. So I lay down my third point, and I still don't have a curve. But as soon as I lay down that fourth point, I get a curve. So a CV curve requires at least 4 vertices to define the curve. And once we get those 4, we can now start drawing as much as we want. Now when I'm done drawing, all I have to do is hit Enter, and the curve is now an object. Now, if I want to edit this curve, I can right-click over it and go into Control Vertex mode. Now, again, we'll see the exact same icons we had when we created it. So I'll have a box on the first vertex, I'll have a U on the second vertex, and the rest of these will be points. Now, one thing to notice is that the points of this curve do not lie exactly on the curve. Typically, they're off to one side. And that's because of the way this curve is constructed. If we were to right-click above it and go into Hull mode, you can kind of see how these individual points are connected. So these CVs basically determine this shape, and the curve is an approximation of that. It's almost like how a subdivision surface approximates the cage in which it resides. I'm going to go back into object mode, and let's go ahead and delete this. Now I'm going to take a look at some of these other ones. The next one is the EP curve tool. Now this is just another way to input a CV curve tool, but let's take a look at how this works. When you click, it creates an X, and then we click another point, it creates another X, and it actually starts creating the curve. And notice how this curve actually goes through the points that you click. So in this case, the points are not off of the curve, but as soon as we hit Enter, the type of curve changes. So if we right-click above it and go Control Vertex, notice how, again, we're getting a CV curve. So this is really just another way to input a CV curve, and sometimes drawing through the points means you're getting a little bit better accuracy. So it's just one additional input method. So I'm going to go back in object mode and delete it. Now this third method is called Bezier curve, and this is actually the one method that really is different than CV curves. So If you're familiar with 2D drawing packages such as Illustrator, these will be pretty familiar to you. So a Bezier curve starts with a click or a click and a drag. And when you click and drag, you drag out a handle. And that handle determines the tangency of the curve. So if I click another handle, you can see how we can control that tangency. So the curve goes through the point, and then the tangency determines how the curve approaches that point. So again, we can click and drag. Now, another nice thing about Bezier curves is that you can create corners very easily. All you have to do is click and not drag. So if I just left click, I can create a corner and create a corner and create another corner. And then if I left click and drag again, I can create a tangent. Now, when I hit enter, it finalizes that curve. And this time, if I right click above it, you'll see that I have slightly different options. So if I go into control vertex, you'll see that, yes, I can see all of my tangents and all of my handles. So if I select this handle, I can control this curve. Select this handle, I can control this part of the curve, and so on. And then again, the corners will stay corners, which is kind of nice because drawing a corner in a CV curve is a little bit difficult. So if you do have to draw corners, consider using Beziers. So now that we have Beziers, we can go ahead and go back into object mode and delete. Now, the other curves all create, again, CV curves. They're just different input methods or different ways to create it. So the first one is the pencil curve tool. And this is really just a free form drawing tool. So all you have to do is left click and you can draw whatever shape you want. Now, if you right click over this, go into control vertex, notice how this is really just a finely grained CV curve. So again, it's still a CV curve. Just has a lot more points. Now, this might be problematic if you create a surface and you get too much detail, so be careful when using the pencil curve tool because it does create a lot of detail. Let's go ahead and select this and delete it. And then we've got two more. One is a 3-point circular arc, the other is a 2-point circular arc. So the 3-point circular arc basically gives you 1, 2 points, and then the third point determines the curvature of that. So as you can see, we can get that 3-point circular arc, hit enter, and if I right click above it, again, it's a CV curve. Now the last one is a 2-point circular arc, and again, very similar input methods, just another way to create a partial circle. So as you can see, there's a lot of different ways to create curves in Maya. Now these curves can be used to construct surfaces. They can also be used as paths. We've seen curves used as paths for extrude, but they can also be used as paths for animation and other types of tools. So go ahead and practice building some curves and get familiar with it because you will be using it a lot in Maya.